welcome to Hindustan Times. You're watching HT Insight, and it's that time of the year again when all eyes are on the Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. Expectations are high that she'll again wave some magic wand when she's presenting a Union Budget 2022-23 on February 1 and address the two issues that have become persistently serious as of now, which are inflation and unemployment. I'm joined by Hindustan Times Editor-In-Chief Sukumar Ranganathan. I'm diving straight in with this million-dollar question, Sukumar. What are your expectations from the budget on these two very serious issues that are plaguing the economy, the country, and the people, unemployment and inflation?
Jobs, especially relevant, and I'm glad we are having this conversation today because we are having this towards the end of a week that has seen significant violence in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar over railway jobs. Right? 10 million people applied for 40,000 jobs, I think, which means for every 250 people who applied, one person will get in, which is an acceptance rate which is lower than that of the Indian Institutes of Management. That's how tough it is to get a railway job. And we have had what one of my colleagues in the newsroom called what could perhaps be India's first unemployment riots. Right? Because you see the kind of violence that's happened over potential irregularities in these issues and everything else in the recruitment. And the reason why you're having this issue is simply because there are not enough jobs to go around. And why are there not enough jobs to go around? At this point in time, from a purely short-term perspective, you can say that one reason is because the services industries have not bounced back to the extent that other industries have bounced back. And by services industry, I'm restricting myself even within services to the so-called high contact services industry. I'm not referring to IT and things like that. IT outsourcing has just zoomed in the past year.
Right.
Both in terms of recruitment and I think in terms of salaries. I'm told that people in IT companies got two hikes last year, not just one, because their companies did so well in terms of business.
I didn't know that. I wish I was in the IT sector. I hear that.
Right?
Yeah.
These days, of course, everyone is an IT employee.
Yeah.
And high contact services have got affected. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is even manufacturing is no longer as job intensive as it used to be. It's become much more capital intensive in terms of the technological inputs that are required in terms of the sophistication of factories required, in terms of the level of automation required, no longer as labor intensive as it used to be. And of course, in India, agriculture, as we all know, is not particularly remunerative. And there are a lot of people who are employed in agriculture. So you have not enough services jobs, not enough manufacturing jobs, and clearly agriculture not remunerative, self-employment not remunerative in this country. Bottom line is, how are you going to create more jobs? What are you going to do that will help generate more jobs? And simple answer to that question is you have to do two things, really. The first one is you have to make agricultural jobs remunerative. It is something that the farm laws might have done according to people who, according to the government, and of course, according to many people who believe that the farm reforms were required. And I'm one of them, right? First thing to do is you make those jobs more remunerative. Those people are not really looking for, not too many of them are really looking for jobs outside the sector. Okay, so that's one thing that you should do. The second thing is India's biggest employer outside agriculture for unskilled jobs is the construction sector. How do you engender or how do you create the circumstances for a construction boom? Clearly, the answer is infrastructure. Clearly, the answer is adequate, a conducive credit regime, which means big projects get enough money to do their thing. Uh, a conducive interest rate regime, which also creates a boom in residential real estate. So if you look at the circumstances under which India's uh, India's economic boom in the 2000s happened, right? I mean, in the middle of the 2000s, we had this period when for 3, 4 years running, the economy expanded in excess of 9%. That was built on a foundation of a huge boom in construction. So what can you do in terms of the construction sector uh, to recreate that kind of environment? Because apart, of course, from the significant linkages that it has to other industries, right? To steel, to cement.
Yes.
But the other thing is also the fact that it is like I said, the largest employer of unskilled labor, uh, including many who work their own fields in the season, and then in the off season they come and do other things, right? So, can you create that kind of environment? And I think this budget should try and do that, right? But there is, of course, the other issue that you raised is inflation. Um,
Right.
to what extent can we control inflation? How much of it is core inflation? See, there is a seasonal aspect of inflation, right? And I think that seasonal aspect of inflation will go over a period of time. The thing that we have to worry about is really fuel inflation. What happens if oil prices firm up to a significant extent? Because that will make the Indian balance sheet, that will make India's balance sheet go out of kilter. Because there's a certain assumption that the budget is going to make with regard to fuel prices. And if, let's say, fuel prices touch $100, like some people are expecting it to touch in the near future, $100 a barrel, um, that could be dangerous and that would be inflationary. But as for the other part of inflation, I think over a period of time, as supply constraints ease, and some of these supply constraints are international, some are of course national, but some are international. But over the course of the next year, as these supply constraints ease, I expect inflation to come down. Right?
Okay, very
So
fascinating. You've touched both the topics, both the key issues, actually, the persistent, serious issues that have been plaguing the economy in the recent past. But in terms of, you've given us a sense of what the issues are and how they need to be tackled. But what are the actual steps that you expect in the budget? And I'm talking about, let's say, let's talk unemployment. What are the actual steps do you see the finance minister taking with regard to sort of resolving that issue, or you know maybe not resolving it immediately, but in the near term and the in the short term and the medium term?
you can't snap your fingers and create jobs. Doesn't
Right.
happen like that, right? So, like I said, an emphasis on infrastructure and on the construction sector can really help create jobs. Um, Assessing every project in terms of how job intensive it is, and focusing on the more job intensive projects can again create jobs. Um, Keeping and now look at what is underlying all this. You have to keep up government spending on capital expenditure,
Right.
because the private sector is still not in a place where it can
True.
pump in enough money. So because if the government continues to invest in infrastructure, if the government continues to invest in large projects, that will obviously result in more construction. It will result in more jobs. It will result in more demand for cement. So, that is clearly one of the things that the budget needs to do. But there is another aspect that the budget needs to focus on, because we've been looking at inflation, we've been looking at jobs, we just discussed infrastructure. The other thing that the government really needs to do, and this is a problem that India has suffered from even before the pandemic struck, we have an aggregate demand problem, right? Demand is not going up.
Right.
How do you increase aggregate demand? Even if you look at the Reserve Bank of India governors, most recent statement at the last monetary policy, he said that RBI will continue to keep its accommodative policy going for some time because he doesn't see that uh, boost in consumption happening, right? And that's not happening because we have an aggregate demand issue. Now, how do you address this? You have to address this in two ways. One, you have to put more money in the hands of people. It's a phrase that everyone uses from time to time, but how can you do that? Uh, you will have to tweak some of the tax measures and clearly put some more money, increase propensity to consume. The other thing that you need to do is because this will also work on the second aspect that I'm coming to, which is sentiment. Because consumer sentiment, again, looking at RBI's consumer confidence index, consumer sentiment is still low, right? You have to increase consumer sentiment because people who feel that the future is going to be better, which is really a measure of consumer sentiment,
Right.
are the kind of people who are going to go out and buy things. So
I
you
think.
know that's going to result in a boost in consumption. Of course, working on if let's assume you do manage to create the circumstances for another construction boom, that in itself will also help demand because you know you're going to create more jobs. There are more people who are going to have money to spend on various things. So that itself will help. But apart from that, I think this is another issue that needs to be addressed, which is really how do you tackle the problem of aggregate demand, which of course brings us to what I think is, let's say, the last thing that we should probably discuss, which that this has bearing on the fiscal deficit, because I don't think the government should set itself too tough a target at this point in time. This is a, to my mind, I see this as a transitory year. I see this as a year when we come out from the grips of the pandemic, but we are still not, uh, or the economy still can't sustain itself without that extra push from which comes from government spending. And I think it's important that the government creates enough fiscal space for itself to continue to spend. So there is something called the fiscal glide path, and
Okay.
and which means it's not a set in stone kind of target. You come down gradually. I think you have to come down very gradually, uh, and make sure that your hands are free to spend. Um, of course, all of this is assuming that we are not hit by another wave of the pandemic, right? I mean,
Yes, that
uh,
is really
uh,
the elephant in the room here because you
yeah,
have spoken about the pandemic, and that is the most uncertain part of everything that we are discussing, or anything that
I,
Nirmala Sitharaman can do probably.
yeah, no, there's very little anyone can do. But again, it's not, there's not too much uncertainty about it because by now, I think we are reasonably confident that we can deal with many of the things that COVID throws at us, right? I mean,
Hmm.
or at least at this point in time, that's how I feel.
Right.
That's how
Let's
many
let's
experts
so,
feel.
so because you're talking COVID and pandemic, let's just briefly, if you can tell me what more can the government? They've already done a host of things as far as healthcare is concerned, but healthcare expenditure in the budget, what is it that one can expect on that front? And
See,
I ask this purely because, yeah,
healthcare last year itself saw an increase, right? This year, I think the one thing that really needs to increase this year is spend on education, because over the last 2 years, one of the
yes,
sectors which has been hit really hard is education. Learning outcomes have suffered. This is a long-term problem, right? I mean, because
right,
you have kids in high school now who probably do not have high school level of learning, but you keep pushing them through the system. So at
right,
10 years from now, you'll have people who are not particularly equipped and or not, they might have the qualifications on paper, but they might not have what it takes. And that means that they're not really going to get a job. Uh, and
right, and
you,
also
you,
about
you're,
the
you're,
school
you're,
kids.
Yeah,
You
you're
know,
setting yourself up for a significant social and economic problem, perhaps 5, 10 years down the line. So, one sector where I would really like to see some intent, and of course, I'd like to see the government back its intent with money, right? I mean, you have to put your money where your mouth is. One sector where I'm really hoping that it happens is education.
right, and especially because the poor children, you're talking about because their studies have really suffered due to lack of access for Wi-Fi or smartphones or laptops. Maybe the budget should also allow for better access to these gadgets for the poor and
That's
needy,
true.
because that is another area that perhaps need looking at. But I think we've spoken quite a bit, and you've touched upon quite a few topics. I just want to sort of take your last thoughts on you meet the finance minister every year, on the budget, on the evening after the day that she's presented the budget. What you see, you have a fair sense of how she's thinking, what are the various issues that are prominent in her mind. Could you give us a sense of what, because it's a very difficult path that she is treading, especially during these pandemic years. Her last budget was a pandemic budget. This year again is the second pandemic budget, really, that she would be presenting. What would be going through her mind right now, before she's, what are the key priority areas do you think she would be looking at? I'm assuming that they would be the same as the ones that we've discussed, but your thoughts on that?
I think most of the issues that we've discussed are probably uh, the kind of things that she will be worried about. I think she will probably end up focusing a lot on infrastructure. Um, I would be very surprised if you don't find something for agriculture in this budget. I also think there will be enough welfare measures or welfare schemes, because I think both the finance minister and the government realize that there are still vulnerable populations in this country which have not recovered from the impact of the pandemic. So I think you're going to find all that. The one thing that I hope they look at is education. And I think the one thing I hope they don't worry too much. The one thing that I hope the finance minister doesn't worry too much about is the fiscal deficit, because, like I said, I see this year's budget as a transitory budget, right? I mean, it's a staging budget. You set yourself up, and then you can move ahead to the next step.
The
So I just
glide
hope.
path, as you said.
Correct. Yeah. So I just hope they continue to remember that. But we'll know in a couple of days.
We'll know in a couple of days. Thank you so much, Sukumar, for joining us for this broadcast. Thank you, viewers, for tuning in. I hope this has been helpful. We'll keep coming back to you with more. Stay tuned to Hindustan Times.